My name is Mark Ledbury, and I am Director of the Power Institute at the University of Sydney, and I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Jolene Rickard, and all of you to the first of our image complex talks. I would first like to acknowledge, as I know we are all dispersed through many parts of Australia and internationally, that the campuses of the University of Sydney are built on the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. For those of you that are not so familiar with the makeup and the complex nations that make up the Australian territory, I'm going to stick in the link a couple of guides for those of you that would like to know more, the IETSIS map of Indigenous Australia, and one from the nationalunitygovernment.org website. I shall do that later in our chat. But I'd like to welcome you all here, and I'm delighted that so many of you are joining us. At the moment, I realize that time zones and technology will mean that people will join in the next few minutes as their technology allows. But I'm delighted that we are able to present this international time zone crossing talk. And I'm first going to say a few words about, I was going to say discipline and power, which of course sounds like a terrible Foucauldian mashup, but is in fact a collaboration, a very collegial one, between the journal Discipline, established by our convener and the person I'm about to introduce you to, Nicholas Croghan, a journal which I think has made a real splash in the contemporary world. Started in Melbourne only a few years back. Its latest issue is on a kind of is on Southern Hemisphere contemporary art between Australia and South America. It's a fantastic and very ambitious enterprise, and we're delighted to be partnering with Discipline. And of course, the Power Institute at the University of Sydney has for over 50 years sought to bring ideas and art into productive collision and collusion, you could say, through talks, publications, research projects, and much more. And you can find out about us on our website at powerpublications.com.au, or you can come along and attend events when they're finally in person again, or you can check in for the next seminars in these series and follow us. But as I say, this speaker series is really the brainchild of Nicholas Croghan, who, as well as being an ABD PhD candidate at Columbia University, where his own thesis explores video technologies and the crisis of industrialization in the long 1970s, if that's such a thing. He's co-founder and co-editor of Discipline, as I was saying, and he's also, to our great good fortune, Power's new programs and events coordinator. And we're absolutely delighted to have Nick working with us. And I'm going to hand over to Nick now to both introduce our distinguished speaker and the series. So thank you all for joining us and welcome. And I shall now hand over to Nick Croghan.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Mark. As Mark mentioned, my name's Nick Croghan, and I'm the Events and Programs Officer at Power Institute, and I'm the co-editor with Helen Hughes and David Homewood of Discipline Journal. I'm speaking today from the sovereign lands of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation, and I'm really delighted to welcome people from Indigenous land all across Australia, and I see from the US as well. This is the first in a new series called Image Complex. Over the course of 4 online sessions between now and May next year, we will explore the interlinked histories of art, power, and visuality in the United States. Our starting point is the concept of the image complex. This term was coined by Yates McKee and Meg McLagan to describe the infrastructure that underpins our visual lives. The image complex is not one thing, but rather a network of people, institutions, technologies, and platforms like the one that we're on right now that produce and circulate visual experience. So this infrastructure produces not only images, but also the very way that we see. To explore this proposition, this series brings together 4 of the most exciting scholars working in and around art history today. Jolene Rickard today is going to speak on Indigenous visual sovereignty, Lisa Lowe on migration and memory, Jennifer Gonzalez on feminist art and war, and Nicole Fleetwood on mass incarceration. Thanks to our online format, these scholars will be speaking to us directly from the United States. In an election year, we do not need to be reminded that the United States is far from being a stable or uncontested concept. Indeed, this series will explore the ways in which the image complex exposes the limits of the United States, even as it reaches beyond them. The ultimate goal of this series, however, is not just to understand the ways in which the image complex governs lives in and outside the US. Instead, our speakers will also tell us about alternative systems of art, visuality, and power that exist alongside the image complex, resisting it and sustaining alternative ways of living. So today, I'm really honored to introduce our first speaker, Professor Jolene Rickard. Jolene is an associate professor at Cornell University and a citizen of the Tuscarora Nation of the Hodinöhsö Confederacy. Jolene is an extremely renowned artist, curator, and art historian whose work is known across the world in fields of art history, curatorial studies, and Indigenous studies. To learn more about Jolene's long and important career in these fields, we're going to start today with a short question and answer between myself and Jolene. After this, Jolene's going to present a roughly 30-minute talk, followed by a more open Q&A. We invite you as the audience to submit questions for us to pose to Jolene if you use the Q&A function, which is in the bottom of your Zoom interface. And when asking your questions, please let us know your name and where you're speaking to us from. We'll also be hearing questions from guests, Stephen Gilchrist and Jessica Hutchins, who I'll be introducing later on. And please note as well that this lecture is going to be recorded, so you will be able to watch over again afterwards. So to begin, Jolene, thank you so much for being here. It's been such a delight to meet you and to become more familiar with your work. I thought I'd begin by asking you if you could tell us a little bit about the land that you're speaking to us from.
Deskaheh, Yachiniti, Jolene Rickard. I'm speaking from the Tuscarora Nation territories, which are located in the western door of the Hodinöhsö Confederacy, which is located very close to Niagara Falls, New York, the world famous icons, just to give you a geopolitical location. I'd like to, of course, acknowledge virtually the peoples of Indigenous peoples and all peoples of Australia. I can't let this moment pass without acknowledging my brothers and sisters in Indigenous peoples all over North America who are living through the pandemic at this point in time. I just want to recognize and remember that we're in this virtual moment because of the pandemic, and that what it's really drawn out is the inequitable conditions of healthcare in North America. At present, the Dene or Navajo Nation has the highest per capita rate of infection as we understand it in the world. And so there's many issues that we still have yet to conquer, and I feel very privileged to be talking about something as empowering as art when I know that there's so many people in the world that are struggling. And so when you ask the question, the space that I'm speaking from a very divisive, enraged, racist, settler state in North America, the United States. And as Indigenous peoples, we are trying to find our way through this to create allyships with the Black Lives Matter, while at the same time insisting that structural racism is based on ongoing colonization. And so I think all publics need a deeper knowledge or a deeper awareness of these structures of conflict and how they're operationalized in our lives. And so, that's, I guess, what I'm thinking about at the moment, and this kind of place, this idea of this place that I'm in. The Tuscarora Nation is one of 3 traditional governments amongst the Hodinöhsö. And what it means is that we've never let go of our way of understanding our relationship to epistemological teachings that are over, thousands of years old. And so we don't have the kind of more recently formed elective systems that many Native peoples have opted for. And so we are still continuing to try to practice a process of coming to consensus with a traditional strategy of the good mind. And I maybe I'll have the opportunity to talk about that a little more later, but that's the place that I'm coming from.
Thank you so much, Jolene, for acknowledging all that. And we're really grateful that you can make it. Please let me know as well if any of these questions are going to replicate stuff you're talking about in your talk later on. But my next question was really to sort of dig into the story that brought you to this point in your career. And I know that you grew up in the US in the 1960s and 70s, which was a period of great political upheaval, both in Australia and in the US, and a moment for a renewed form of Indigenous activism. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your experience growing up in that moment and whether what impact it might have had on your life or your later career, if at all.
Yes, I mean, the 60s and the 70s. And so I was, it's difficult to use that 20-year window, but I think of my experiences from a family that's consistently fought for sovereignty. And so I don't really have like a specific bookmark around that 20-year period. It goes back much earlier, and then it moves forward as well. But I think it's worth it to understand that the 60s in North America are really that moment of the demand or assertion of civil rights. And that is, of course, an allied relationship to Latinx and Black peoples in North America. And the 70s, of course, we saw the continued second wave of feminism really push against the overt patriarchal space in the arts. And so it was actually in academic spaces that we began to see more resistant narratives and demand for intellectual equity. And in that space, we saw emerge a discourse of diversity. And at that period of time, it was called multiculturalism. For Indigenous peoples, probably the single most important event in North America was the Second Wounded Knee. And so Second Wounded Knee happened in 1973, and it energized Indigenous activism. And it expressed itself in my life through the traveling caravan called the White Roots of Peace, which came out of Akwesasne, which is a Mohawk community along the settler state border of Canada and the United States. And the White Roots of Peace was, I think, a consistent, today the terminology that someone like Leanne Simpson uses is resurgence. But in most of our territories, I think there has been a continued insistence upon understanding and renegotiating our core epistemological views and values. And so it was actually through the White Roots of Peace that I think many young peoples in our communities were politicized. And so that, I think, was a kind of conscious turning point.
I know that in the late 1970s, you moved to New York and started practice as an artist in New York. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like to be an artist in New York City in the 80s, and tell us a bit as well about the colleagues that you worked with and the institutions that supported you. It's worth noting that Jolene was part of a number of really landmark exhibitions during that decade.
Right. Well, thanks for the question. Yeah, New York City at that period of time was still considered one of the most dangerous places in the world. And of course, I moved to one of the most violent neighborhoods at that period of time. I was living in the Lower East Side between 7th, on 7th Street between A and B, which was just at the base of what they called Needle Park. But it was actually an amazing experience. I mean, it was the place where on Sunday morning you'd wake up and Sun Ra and his followers were, dancing in the park. And it was also where the graffiti movement really was birthed. And, the Lower East Side was just an amazing cacophony of artist-run centers and galleries. The gallery that and center that really helped me to understand the arts world better than any other place in the city at that period of time was actually part of the American Indian Community House. And so in North America at that period of time, there had already been in the 1940s and 50s, there had already been the forced removal of indigenous peoples to urban spaces. And in those urban spaces, there were, funded and although never funded to, really succeed, but funded just to exist, support spaces for we've gone through a number of different kinds of levels of naming, and I'm sure that most people are familiar with this, but sometimes we're using the word Indian, but at that period of time, people were American Indians or Native Americans. Of course, now we use the language, many of us use the language of Indigenous to talk about a broad framing of this shared experience. And so, these urban centers became places to gather. And this particular urban center in New York City actually had quite a distinguished gallery that was run by a number of very well-known curators. Lloyd Oxendine and G. Peter Jemison were two very distinguished directors of the American Indian Community House Gallery. The gallery actually became a kind of base for introductions and networking to other spaces in New York City at that period of time. And so in that gallery space, I was able to actually develop a lifelong friendship with Lucy Lepard. At that period of time, Jean Fisher was collaborating with Jimmy Durham. The young, at the time, young curator Paul Chatt-Smith was still working for the Treaty Council. And so it was quite an extraordinary moment to have a number of indigenous peoples coming into dialogue with this emergent curiosity and also discussion around how to, what does it mean to be Indigenous or Native American and practice art at that same period of time. I mean, I can't say this without saying that, of course, we all had day jobs, right? We were all working day jobs and trying to network and get our work out there. And I can't say there was a ready reception in the arts world because the vocabulary to understand this work really was just beginning to emerge. And so at that period of time, there was still this idea that the ambition was to become part of some kind of centralized art scene, which of course we all know is a fiction and never really existed. And so this was both, I guess, the beginning and deterioration of that center.
So I know, Jolene, as well, that it was really in the 1980s and 90s that you started working on and thinking about the concept of sovereignty, which is going to be the subject of your talk today. So my last question before we segue to your talk is to shift to the early 90s, which the year 1992 was an important one in the United States. It was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in America, but it was also a really landmark year for Indigenous art. And there was a number of key exhibitions that year, as well as a sort of wave of new visibility within the art world for Indigenous artists and art practices. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about your experience of that moment and how it impacted your own work, and perhaps whether it was an influence in your shift later on in that decade to curatorial practices.
The 1992, it was a number of exhibits. You're right, a number of exhibits helped to network Indigenous artists across North America. And it also, I think, made us more aware of artists in Canada as well. And so a pivotal person in this discussion, of course, is the Shoshone artist, John Quick-to-See Smith. And John had developed a professional relationship and friendship with Bernice Steinbaum, and I'm forgetting her partner's name, her husband's name, but Bernice, of course, was one of the editors of a feminist journal called Helicon 9. And so it kind of opened up this entire feminist artist network that John Quick-to-See Smith was a part of, including peoples like Harmony Hammond, etc. And so Jean was very generous with her contacts and worked tirelessly to network Indigenous peoples, Indigenous artists into as many experiences as she possibly could. Phil Young, also a Cherokee artist, also curated an important exhibit, Symbolic, which is of course Columbus spelled backwards. And so the impetus, of course, behind this is that I think one of the Bushes, President Bush, was trying to create a national celebration around the arrival of Columbus. And so these exhibits were specifically designed and put in place as a counter narrative to this notion that there was anything to celebrate with this idea of this early phase of contact and the impact of this kind of colonization, that, for Indigenous peoples marked, I would argue became this sort of modern moment when this kind of destructive change began to happen. And so it's, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in really understanding this moment, but it certainly, you know, another center, I think, of this discussion was actually in San Francisco. And of course, the Institute of American Indian Art, which was formed in the 1960s by a federal act of legislation. One of the, I think it's the only Native arts school in the federal system. All of these places were kind of like hotbeds of activity during that period, you know, but it was clearly understood as a decelebration.
Jolene, I would mention to our audience that Jolene has really a large number of really important and enjoyable writings from this period, in addition to her work as an artist and a curator. And I wanted to mention in particular one article from '95 called "Sovereignty, a Line in the Sand," which has really emerged as a really important piece of writing from that period in the broader field of studies of sovereignty. So on that note, I wanted to pass across to you, Jolene, to talk about Indigenous visual sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Okay, so just give me a second here. I want to share some images with you, and we'll take it from there.
While you're doing that, Jolene, I'll just say again to our audience that we will be taking questions from you. So please type in your questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom interface. And we'll try to get to as many as we can after Jolene's talk. And in posing your question, please let us know your name and where you're speaking from. Thanks.
Okay. And so I want to do just a little case study because there's so many people today using the term visual sovereignty. And there are multiple, I think, meanings of not only the term sovereignty, but even the term visual sovereignty. And so I wanted to share with you my relationship to it. And I think I have a certain purchase or agency in this because my family was deeply involved in the deployment of this term in the early 20th century in both Hodinöhsö territories and in international politics. And so this is my grandfather, Chief Clinton Rickard, who was part of the Beaver Clan and Tuscarora Nation. And he is marching across one of the bridges between the settler spaces of Canada and the United States. What's significant about this march is that our people, the Hodinöhsö, span 2 nation states, several states and provinces in both of these places as our ancestral or traditional homelands. And so when the border crossed us, we still have to maintain our relationship to our sister nations, and the Indian Defense League of America was formed as a resistance organization in order to enact the recognition of the Jay Treaty of 1794. And so this led to the strategy by the Confederacy to send someone to, at the period of time, the League of Nations. The League of Nations was located in Switzerland, which was the precursor to the United Nations, now located in New York City. The much beleaguered United Nations, I might add. And so we see the title holder, Deskaheh, or Levi General, was that person that actually went to and petitioned the League of Nations to recognize the Hodinöhsö as an independent nation state. and not a dependent within the settler state system. And so this effort happened in the 1920s. And so the consciousness that we're not citizens of any settler state, that we haven't ceded our rights to the colonizer, is something that I was born into, and it was consistently practiced and fought for within my own family. And then scholars in this area note a significant intervention that took place in Geneva, Switzerland in 1977, and another intervention, of course, that took place in 1992. And all of these efforts today have culminated in UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights. And so that's, a highly problematic yet very important instrument of the assertion of sovereignty for Indigenous peoples globally. And so, the history of the Declaration of Indigenous Rights is important because of how the votes were taken. And I think it's important to also note that for Hodinöhsö peoples, that we are in a position of having amongst the few treaties with the United States that have secured our sovereignty. And so every year our people come together, leaders, the descendants, the title holders come together, and the original title holders would have signed the Treaty of Canandaigua of 1794. And so the Treaty of Canandaigua, in the relationship between the United States and the Hodinöhsö, is that space where, or that document where in the US legal system acknowledges our sovereignty or nationhood. And so this is marked with your observing treaty, the wampum belts, which is our way of signifying this space. So we have both physical, ceremonial, performative, and visual documentation of our relationship to the United States. And it is not a relationship that would be considered subjugate, although today legal historians want to construct Indigenous peoples in North America as quasi-sovereign. And so the United States, within its legal system, has the right to identify us in this way. But part of my understanding of sovereignty has always been that we actually determine our own sense of autonomy in a global space. And so even though we have been represented this way in the legal record, I was raised in an environment where we asserted that our peoples are looking for this longer lens of our autonomy. And so I share this with you because, it isn't, there are so many interpretations now of this idea of sovereignty that I felt in the 1980s when I began looking at what was happening in our communities, I realized that that I thought that the arts were one of the most empowered spaces within Indian country. And there's an interesting kind of relationship between the process of art making for Indigenous peoples and then the space that arts occupy in the at the period of time, you know, perhaps we're using more of a didactic language of the Eurocentric West. And, you know, I mean, I think the debate would be considered today in the Black Lives Matter, and if anything has really changed. But at that period of time, we were still really conscious of how we as Indigenous peoples and makers were marginalized within a broader discussion of the arts. And so the thing about growing up within Hodinöhsö communities, and in particular, I have to acknowledge in my own family, is that I was actually, this is my own identity card. And this is, of course, an old one, because today we're having this big debate about we want to get the identity cards with the chip-ins so that we can move as our own citizens with our own passports and citizenship around the world. And of course, this has been thwarted by the Canadian government. And I think, of course, you know, I mean, it's by both the Canadian and US governments. But when I was growing up, I was expected to really understand each of the treaties that affirmed our sovereignty. And so it was it's been interesting to me that and then I just want to share this image with you, because this is an image of the recitation of the Gayogo, or the Great Law, which is the founding epistemological message that defines the governing and philosophical structure of the Hodinöhsö that's over 1,000 years old, that's represented in all of the wampum belts that you see laid on the table. And they are also in dialogue with the assertion of treaties, which of course are the agreements between the Hodinöhsö and the United States and Canada, sometimes Great Britain, Great Britain, of course. Canada assumed, or should have assumed, the stewardship of these treaties, but that's another discussion. But I think it's important to share these experiences because the notion of sovereignty for me has these very deep historical, governing, political roots that are anchored in both the cosmological, epistemological, philosophical, and certainly material visualization of these ideas through the wampum belts. And so this particular assertion of sovereignty, and here are all the belts, and then of course the visualization of the Hodinöhsö, historically referred to as the 5 nations, and then 6, which is a different lecture about the relationship of the Tuscarora to the Hodinöhsö. But what I think as an art historian, as a visual historian, is important is that in order to understand, I think, fully the space or the Indigenous art, that I think in the field we need an enormous retooling of history, because I don't really think it's possible to drop in on this work without really having an understanding of treaty relationships, the legal space of Indigenous peoples in relationship to settler states, the philosophical underpinnings of each Indigenous peoples whose artwork you're encountering, and then also what the symbolic language of that is. And so we spend most of our time in education, of course, learning about a Northern European, now hegemonic American, perhaps, in some cases it might be slanted towards Asian histories. And so this is, I think, a really important moment where we have to learn these other experiences. But the, and so the two-row, of course, is a commemoration and really important part of this. And this particular demonstration of the two-row was actually made by the Hodinöhsö Artists Guild and was furled out in front of the UN at the 400th year marker of that relationship. And so, for me, in the 1990s, we saw a kind of resistance. So that we see the emergence of the fields. American Indian studies came out of the student movements in the 1960s to early 70s. By the 1990s, we see the development of the discourse of Indigenous studies. And so Indigenous studies, I think, primarily was influenced by Native literature. And now we see incredible blossoming of it and expansion of it. But at that period of time, there were also scholars from Haudenosaunee communities, like the prominent scholar Gerald Alford or Cayuga, who was arguing against the use of sovereignty, the use of the word sovereignty as the appropriation of a European monarchical concept that had no place in Indigenous thought or activism. And so I resisted that notion because I do not think that my ancestors or the people, the leaders in our community today who still think in terms of protecting our sovereignty as a key and fundamental aspect of their role as leaders. And so I've never been part or signed on for the discussion that we use this term in the same way that it's deployed in a European context. And so our use of sovereignty is much more about our continued resistance to settler state oppression. And so one of the things that we insist upon is that we will continue with our way of life without interference of other ways of life. And so this kind of way of life phrase, which is, I think, embodied in the work of Alan Michelson and his installation of the two-row, which is at the border of between the US and Canada, where the Mohawk Nation is situated. And the irony of this exquisite installation is that you have to be detained in order to see it. And so, but it's nonetheless an important installation of a demonstration of this idea in public space. And just some other interpretations of this. And then of course, I think probably the update of the resistance that took place at the Second Knee in '73 was the resistance at Gayogo, or what people refer to as Oka. And so here we have, I think, a demonstration of sovereignty and what I would call visual sovereignty. And so in the I guess in this moment, I saw artists being the most dynamic resistors in Indian country from the 1980s onward. And maybe it was because it was in this category of art, the arts, that there was room for the possibility of reimagining Indigenous space. And I saw artists working to bring ideas of our deep roots that today people think of as place-based knowledge into contemporary experiences. And so there's so much to contemplate, because Ellen Gabriel, who was one of the leading spokespersons for the resistance at Kahnawake, is still having to defend their territory. And so sovereignty is a kind of ongoing resistance to dispossession. And as Hodinöhsö people, we live in the Golden Triangle, located between, in the Northeast in the United States, between some of the wealthiest cities, and certainly one of the wealthiest states and one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And so in order for us to maintain our land base and to maintain our space, we have had to be strategic in how we think about this. And so sovereignty, framed only from a legal perspective, I felt was limiting. And so that's where I broke out and attached this notion of visual sovereignty, because one of the phrases I would consistently hear from my grandfather is, "We will never win in their courts." So we will never have justice in a settler state system. Now, I mean, you can argue there are certain cases that seem to prevail, but overall, we haven't had a lot of luck in either Canadian or US, or maybe you've had better luck in Australia or Aotearoa or New Zealand. I mean, we need to do the work of the comparative studies, I think. But, and let me just share something else with you, because I'm specifically developing this kind of like Hodinöhsö model because I think sovereignty expresses itself in different ways in different communities. And so I'm very specific that the kind of sovereignty that I practice, the kind of visual sovereignty that Ellen Gabriel practices, is really based on wanting to continue to have a relationship, a deep relationship to a territory that we believe our people have been located in from the beginning of time, or as long as memory serves. And that based on observational practices, we've developed a storied landscape that helps us to understand our place in the world through this place. And so that's what's embedded in this red post, the piece that Ellen shared with us. And of course, there are many, I mean, it's a different kind of lecture to go into the specific details of the iconographic gestures of each of these pieces, because Indigenous work is so rich with the visual lexicon of symbols that are ancient yet have been contemporized. And you know, some of you, of course, recognize the turtles. Some of you may recognize the sky dome. Some of you may recognize the double curve motif. And when you begin to, you know, and you're at another level when you can begin to interpret and synthesize how the artist is intending it to be read. And so if I were talking to an audience of specialists interested in Hodinöhsö iconography, it would be very rich to go into this kind of detail. But what I think the artist does is they bring together the synthesis of those ideas, and they also bring in the contemporary vocabulary. And so in this case, the artist, the Mohawk artist Jasmine Gunn, gathered up the gun shells from the aggression against the Mohawk peoples that took place at Ganasatake, and turned it into this tapestry, along with elements of the pine cones that were lifted from the land that was actually and continues to be in dispute. And so there's a kind of richness of detail that when you understand our histories, you understand the materials, the relationship to place, that begins to make this work come alive. And so all of this work in some way is a demonstration of visual sovereignty. And of course, the work of the internationally recognized Rebecca Belmore, who in this case is flying the Louis Hall symbol that's come to represent this resistance. It's the warrior flag. And so it's a combination of things that are taking place in our communities that artists, I believe, have kind of been out in front of. And so we've been performing our resistance to being categorized as citizens of settler states, or being categorized as quasi-sovereign. And we embed these ideas in visual and material expressions. Again, this is a satirical fashion show based on a familiar knowledge of the resistance, and I'm just quickly moving through just some images that just affirm this place. And so now I'm working and living in a space that has rejected the return of the Gayogo or the Cayuga people after their displacement in the Clinton-Sullivan campaign. And I can't go into the Clinton-Sullivan campaign, but it basically was a scorched earth or burnt earth campaign against the Hodinöhsö people that was ordered by Deskaheh, or the President of the United States. And so our people have appropriated a Seneca word, Deskaheh, which means literally town burner. And that's our name for the person that occupies the place of President of the United States. And it's interesting how that name has been fulfilled each time a new person steps into that position. And so this experience of dispossession isn't something that's unique to the Hodinöhsö. And so what we begin to see in the study of Indigenous art is if you understand a case study of one people's, you can begin to see parallel experiences amongst Indigenous peoples globally. And then where it becomes unique is the way in which a world is formed through a cosmological story, the specific visual, iconographic, or lexicon of symbols. But the settler state or colonial period is something that is kind of transportable as an intellectual understanding and of course a historic understanding across Indigenous communities with maybe different time periods or markers. And so therefore, I think the term visual sovereignty can be applied broadly across expressions that are coming from Indigenous artists that are specifically trying to in some way maintain their relationship to the knowledge that they inherit from their ancestors while strategically continuing to locate them in a place. And idea, I feel, and this, I mean, here are the things, the story that drive me, it's that it's a hunt for this if moment can mark use the first term sovereignty. Our colleague Paul Williams, who's a bachelor in Canada, also would argue this concept play at the moment contact word, and so I can't do that definitive moment when we think it became active in our, but I can say that it became public. The assertion of the Hodinöhsö and the course were also part of the sending delegation to the League of Nations to our autonomy. And so this that I for actually in the 1980s that sovereignty has multiple dimensions, not just be located legal framing, visual sovereignty based on called the ongoing assertion by artists and curators, people that are of all different of absentees, that was a opening up that connection between the political, the philosophical. And so I see the two together in this term. And then now there's multiple ways that it's being expressed across Indigenous spaces. And so this is an early piece that I did, brought together political with philosophical. And the corn blue actually is being interpreted as of food sovereignty. And there's all kinds of assertion that, asserts, idea of her ability to mitigate the ongoing pressure of colonialism as a strategic sovereignty being strategic, a strategy that is sometimes, it's important from a notion of nationhood, sometimes important to be able to feed oneself, food sovereignty. Sometimes it's important to be able to liberate the mind, where I really felt sovereignty important role. But multiple expressions of it today. And so I'm particularly drawn to the work of somebody like Jordan, who, exuberant kind of expression of a kind of logical marking that is in the latest edition of Canada. They were calling Quinn Deskaheh, meaning fire. Is this kind of this next generation of incredibly artists and and thinkers that are deeply interested in understanding the knowledge from their cultural spaces, activating it in different ways. Multiple strategies Indigenous today. Peoples are opting to be visible in nation politics. The show are continuing to our autonomy. And so, you know, talking about a particular way of expressing as Indigenous people, and it doesn't just everyone. Many that don't have a specific claim to territory, don't have a direct relationship, but I argue that, you know, we all take responsibility, and that you don't really think you really get to on this identity actually unless you act taken responsibility. I'll leave it there, and we'll have you know, one and I've touches if we just need to. So Nyawa. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jolene, for the talk. For me, I thought we might questions by cutting to a couple of questions from Gilchrist, who belongs to the Yamatji, the Ngada language group of North West, and he's also the professor at the University of Sydney, which is institute. Stephen, known to our audience, he's curated museums in Australia and the United States, and he's written extensive Indigenous art. I'll pass across to Stephen now, if you'd like to jump in and ask.
Thanks, Nicholas, so much, Joe. I am important to remember that our sovereignty is with us, particularly where we don't have treaties. The debate going at the moment in Australia is now termed Australia. This move towards perhaps a national institution of Indigenous art. And do you think these kinds of wholly Indigenous institutions are like the most appropriate spaces for the expression of kind of Indigenous representational and visual sovereignty? Or is it also important to kind of push up against the limits of sovereignty or counter-sovereignty in other kinds of state-based institutions?
I think that's a really important observation, and I can think of three national spaces: the Canadian Museum and Civilization, which is now the Canadian History Museum, and the First Peoples Hall, the National Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian. And then I think of also Te Papa as kind of like these broad national spaces that, you know, I think have a certain presence. And so I don't think we should think in terms of this or that, though. I feel that we should want both. Mm-hmm. And so there are different, I think, you know, the pressure is that we don't have enough spaces right now to actually complicate our success at continuing to be Indigenous. And so I just don't think the world is prepared for that. I think that in the era of modernity, which I would argue most settler states are still part of, they're both modern and they're both, which is very Eurocentric, and they're also neo-colonial. I don't think they yet understand that we are the future, that our way of understanding how to be in this world has brought us to the place that we're at, and so I guess when we engage in these institutions, we have to, I think, decide what it is we're sharing and how we're positioning ourselves. But from within our communities, I think we understand that that the fantasy that we were captured and colonized is still the dominant fantasy in the settler state. And I don't know, maybe we take advantage of that. We certainly interrupt it with our art, is what I would argue. And it shouldn't, I mean, and I'm not arguing for like us and them, but I am saying that there has to be space for us. And so in a way, I think your question points to this sort of profound need for these spaces. And there's spaces where perhaps citizens of settler states can adjust to our not only arrival, but continuance.
Thank you, Jolene.
Thank you so much for that, Stephen. Our next question comes from Jessica Hutchins, who's a Paluku woman. She's coming to us from Perth today, and she's, like myself, currently undertaking a PhD in art history at the University of Oxford. And she was also recently the curatorial assistant to the artistic director for the 22nd Biennale of Sydney, which was titled Niran, and which Jolene has written about recently online in the publication Art Practical. I'll pass across to Jessica now.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, Jolene. That was really insightful and interesting. And I was particularly interested in the idea you spoke of about this connection between the political and the philosophical that's enabled by kind of visual sovereignty. And I was wondering if in that regard, you think of visual sovereignty as being something that's both kind of an assertion of sovereignty, often materializing a lot of, the complexity of sovereignty, and whether it can also be kind of, a form of thinking about sovereignty, of posing questions, of thinking through a lot of the dilemmas and complexity that you've raised today. And if you see that as opening up a space for kind of thinking through sovereignty as well as being sovereignty.
Hi, Jessica. Nice to meet you. I think that these are the things that I recognize, that in the field of art history, we now begin to see the use of the language of multiple cosmologies. We see an awareness, or at least a use of the terminology or discussion of multiple worldviews in the way in which art is being described. There isn't the assumption that there's only one way of understanding a formation of reality. And so I think we should think of this as an exciting moment that we have to negotiate multiple realities, multiple constructions of thought and time and place whenever we encounter any Indigenous peoples. And at the same time, we can have these exchanges, and I can be here at Tuscarora, and you can be in Australia, and we can have this exchange. Unfortunately, because of our common experience as being, part of a colonizing or neo-colonial settler state system. And so we need to have multiple perspectives working at the same time. And I don't think we can privilege one over the other, but we have to recognize the terms of our relationship to the places that we're in, deeply, historically from the past, while at the same time understanding the changes they've undergone. And we can't do it any longer just in like regional isolation. We have to do it on a global scale. And so there is a usefulness and a kind of theorization of this, right? And so in a sense, visual sovereignty is our theory, right? It's a way for us to like put all of these things and ideas into it and then debate the interpretation, right? And so it's interesting because nobody really ever wants to give Indigenous peoples or, credit for actually theorizing things. But I would argue that visual sovereignty is a kind of theory.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I completely agree. I think it's, it's such powerful philosophy coming through our art. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I wanted to say as well to our audience, you can post in questions using the Q&A function. You can also sort of vote for questions that have already been posed. And the top question we have at the moment is from Brooke Andrew, who is, of course, the director of the Sydney Biennale, which is still ongoing. And this relates to your practice, Jolene, as a curator in a lot of ways. In our introductory conversation, we talked about your work as a photographer, an artist in the 80s, 70s and 80s. But of course, in the 90s, you shifted strongly towards curatorial practice. And I wanted to note in particular that you played a really key role in curating the permanent exhibitions at the US National Museum of the American Indian. And so perhaps within that framework, I'll pose to you Brooke's question, which is, have you seen a committed engagement in museums to shift display methodologies of First Nations objects through a sovereign perspective and engaging issues like community consultation? If so, this truly First Nations led and does be part of ideological ways of working?
Hello, Brooke. To meet you and congratulations on near. I'm more sad than my ability to come and see. I think it was a spectacular generation of, and so I thank you for visual sovereignty. And an excellent question. And so I think that, and I'll just share with you the major installations from what I thought of as a museological intervention that I made at the National Museum of the American Indian in 2004. And so, you have, like, for the NMAI, I was trying to work with their collections, millions of objects, material culture that had been completely underutilized. And so the whole premise of the museum at that time, and this is, already 20 plus years ago, was to actually consult with communities. And you and I both know that it's really fraught, this notion of consulting with community. And so there's this constant issue to sort of like get to what some people refer to as grassroots or community. And I think it's much more complex than just that idea. So on that point alone, I think what people have a lack of respect for, what curators, sometimes cultural workers have a lack of respect for, is that within Indigenous spaces, there are some people that have simply more awareness and knowledge about the epistemological material relationships that express an Indigenous worldview. And so sometimes those people are not in leadership positions. And so there's a bit of homework that needs to be done in order to understand if you're actually working with the right set of people or the right group of people. So idea of like community consultation is very complex. And so at NMAI, all kinds of versions of it took place. But in the end, Paul Chet-Smith and I actually had to do these larger hemispheric installations. And we tried to, just very quickly, I'll share with you that we tried to create what we thought of as observation on the ongoing impact of colonization. And so the Gold Wall at that period of time was the most photographed installation on the Smithsonian's Museum Mall during the time the exhibit was up. And it, it was, you led into that space with, from this, ceramic, all of the vessels that made by peoples long before this moment of contact. And what was significant for me about all of these beings, all of these vessels, is that we didn't know any longer the peoples, the direct peoples that these things came from. And so they were kind of blunted or silenced by the violence that took place at contact. And so, of course, there's lots of controversy around these installations. And so they were a hybrid, a kind of artistic expression of this, wealth of expression of peoples from the Americas at that period of time. And at the same time, they weren't taxonic, that we were not trying to educate someone on individual pieces and their stylistic form or any of those kinds of things. And so, and these were great tensions that I still think get played out at the Met. It gets played out at the Quai Branly. It gets played out in these larger spaces. There is this idea, this constant idea to be able to categorize instead of to begin to think about broader concepts. And so I do think that in different parts of the world, different parts of museological practice in the world, and part of this, I think, is the demand of Indigenous peoples in those spaces has accelerated the conversation. And so, of course, it can't be lost on anybody that yourself as an Indigenous person is the director of, this world-renowned biennial. And something like that has simply not occurred yet in North America. And so, we have yet to be featured or been able to kind of claim this space in the United States. And so as much, I think, outside of the United States, there are greater advances than in the United States. And so even though it represents itself as being ahead of other people, I think it's very behind in this way in some of these practices. And it's not a criticism of my colleagues who are really trying to resolve these questions or do this work. I just, this week I just read that the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for the first time ever, has hired an Indigenous curator. And so, I mean, there is some advance being made, but as far as community consultation and what that means, I can say that I didn't see it happen in their first iteration of the installation in the American wing at the Met. And so I'll leave it there, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brooke. I'm going to pose two more questions to you, Jolene. from our audience. The first is from Chaitanya Sambrani, who's speaking from Ngunnawal country at the Australian National University. Chaitanya says, it would be great to hear your thoughts on the relationship between sovereignty and solidarity. Sovereignty being premised on distinctive and unique conditions particular to specific contexts and peoples, whereas solidarity persists in the subsuming of such uniqueness in service of a shared sense of purpose. And the second question is from Brenda Croft, distinguished artist and curator and art historian, who is speaking to us today from the Ngunnawal traditional lands. And she says, I'm interested in your concept of Indigenous First Nations peoples who have been displaced from sovereign lands and communities taking responsibility. Could you please expand on that for us? So two related questions there, I think. Okay.
Hi, Chinita and Brenda. Let me see if I can try and address these. So my interpretation of sovereignty is that it is a strategic way in which we continue to want to maintain our, to use a kind of 20th century term, this idea of nationhood. And so we want to stay together as communities. We want to have a sense of relationship to peoples that we've been traveling through time for, and try to maintain this space, because in this there are philosophies and there's deep, I don't think I have to, reinforce to this audience, the significance of the philosophies in relationship to deep knowledge, observational knowledge about place. And so sovereignty and visual sovereignty becomes an agent of maintaining what in the 20th and 21st century we've argued for as nation. Now, I know that's a highly contentious framing. Some people use the idea of community, and I think community is has a little is not as politically potent as thinking of it in terms of like these governance structures. And so solidarity, of course, is I think an important allied. It's typically, I think, about allied relationships. And you have solidarity around human rights, solidarity around anti-racist expressions. But I haven't seen where the term solidarity actually addresses our insistence that we are not, and this of course is also contentious because all Indigenous people don't take this position, but and this is where, for me, it's important to say that from a Hodinöhsö perspective, it means that we're not, we use that metaphor of the two-row, we want to stay in our way of life. We want to travel our way down the river of life. And so, but it's not to say that we can't share and have allied experiences. So thank you. And Brenda, hi Brenda, I wish I could see you. I can't see anybody right now, but thank you for the provocative question that you've given me. This is a constant discussion. I mean, we have so many issues with what is Indigenous and who belongs and how, what their agency is. And so I guess I can't express it in a different way except for in my own community right now, we're trying to reclaim our relationship to a very particular practice that's called a longhouse way of life. And it's, you know, it's doing the hard work. It's about, you know, working with people in your own community, being responsible to them, and as a people thinking forward. And so I'll confess that when I initially began going to our longhouse meetings, I would speak the way I normally speak, and people just like wanted to throw darts at me because they thought my language was too jargon ridden. And I had to confess, you know, and you know, it was. And so I had to really think about what I was doing. And so then, you know, I look across the kind of academic horizon, because that's certainly one of my arenas. And then I look across the arts horizon, and I see a lot of people out there that claim this space, but they never have to do any work. You know, they don't really have to care for, you know, they don't really have to be accountable. And so if you're going to claim the space, I think you need to have some accountability, you need to take some responsibility, you need to do the work to actually be able to claim the space. So I know this isn't a popular position, right? But if all we're left with in 50 years is a whole bunch of people that are claiming Indigenous subjecthood, but know nothing of the history, our traditions, the practice, why there's a resurgence of our languages, why understanding languages, even if you're not a speaker, is important to understanding place. You know, where will we be? What will we really have accomplished? And so I'm kind of at that place where I respect this very kind of particular way of understanding the world that we've inherited from our ancestors, that is, you know, Indigenous peoples all over the world. This isn't unique just to Hodinöhsö. It's all, you know, that we've inherited this tome of thinking. And it's, you know, I mean, we could go into how that thinking wasn't supported by institutions and didn't have the support of a taxpayer base to actually reproduce it, yet it still flourished. And so that to me is knowledge that's worth knowing about. And so, but I don't think you get to say that you're of us unless you actually, you know, make the effort to actually know us. So I'm probably lost half, you know, lots of friends out there for saying this, but it's where I'm at, right? Sorry.
Jolene, we've very sadly reached our time limit. I'm sure we could keep going for a lot longer, and I'm sure people would love to hear us do so. But we'll have to end the lecture now. But before I do, I wanted to say a few thank yous. Firstly, to the Power Institute for supporting this series, to my co-editor Helen Hughes at Discipline Journal, to Rob Milne, who did the design, the lovely design we have for the series, and the person who's been pulling the strings but not visible, which is Mara Gonzalez, who's been our amazing producer today. If you would like to see our next image complex lecture, we'll be including, we're speaking with Lisa Lowe from Yale University, and she'll be talking about migration, materiality, and memory. And that will be on the 30th of October, so look out for the link to register for that coming soon. Power also has a lecture in our Sydney Asian Art Series with the University of Alberta scholar Lisa Claypool, and a screening of Zhao Liang's film Behemoth Those are both coming up next week and should be really wonderful. If you'd like to hear more about the sort of events we do, sign up to our mailing lists on the Discipline website and the Power website. And finally, if you'd like to see more of these sorts of events, please let us know. And also let us know how we've done with this new online format. You will have received in your inbox a link to take a very short survey about this, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. So with that, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much to Jolene for a really rich talk. And we hope to see you again very soon. Okay.